Right, it is right at 4 o'clock. I think that we could go ahead and get started, and those who need to join us late can do that. Kelly, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and your webinar.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Kelly Perales. I am part of the Midwest PBIS Network, one of the regional hubs of the National PBIS Technical Assistance Center, and I'm going to be talking with you today about how Interconnected Systems Framework supports trauma-informed practices. Please note that the content today is prepared by myself along with a team. As leaders from the National PBIS Technical Assistance Center have coalesced with leaders in the fields of school mental health, including the National Center, for more than 10 years now around this idea of aligning and integrating school mental health and PBIS. And further, colleagues on my Midwest team help to develop the content around trauma-informed practices. And so I want to acknowledge all of my colleagues and also note that this material is not solely developed by myself. And I want to set the stage by having us share a common understanding of what an interconnected systems framework is all about. And many years ago, as I said, over a decade now, leaders in these fields really thought about how could we purposefully and intentionally better align and integrate our work. And here you see a definition of expanded school mental health, where the big idea is that it's really a shared agenda between community mental health providers and leaders in education, and augmenting the work of school-employed staff or clinicians who are already working in schools, such as psychologists, social workers, and counselors. And we want to ensure that there's a full continuum of mental health promotion and intervention for all students along a multi-tiered system of support. PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports, is currently implemented in over 27,000 schools that we have in our National Center database. This is a decision-making framework that is really about using what we have as available data to make decisions about the evidence-based interventions we select and install and monitor within our schools. And it's really about ensuring that we're addressing all of the social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of all students. We utilize this framework as a way to enhance and expand with school mental health because we have 21 years now of research, evaluation, and data to tell us that when done well, PBIS improves outcomes for students, for teachers, and reduces exclusionary discipline. And again, as I said, Dr. Mark Weiss, Dr. Joni Splett, others among our leadership group have been thinking about and studying this work for many years and trying to write about and define how it plays out in states, districts, and schools. And so here's an article that was published back in 2014 around the work that's happened in South Carolina specifically. And since that time, we have had now a random control trial that included a district in South Carolina and a district in Florida. And we are still working on publishing the final findings from that data because the study just concluded in the spring of the last school year. So we're really talking here about a public health framework. Big idea is we want to organize our resources so kids get help early. We want to do stuff that's likely to work, which is speaking to those evidence-based interventions. We want to support staff by professional development and ongoing technical assistance and coaching so that we can install interventions to fidelity and monitor those outcomes for impact. Back in 2013, we published this first monograph on interconnected systems framework. The chapters are organized by state, district, and school. Again, leaders from our National Center for PBIS as well as the Center for School Mental Health co-authored the chapters. And this document we know is still widely used in districts and schools today. And we have been putting the finishing touches on a second volume to that monograph, which is really an implementation guide following the stages of implementation out of the National Implementation Research Network. And currently the chapters are available at midwestpbis.org. So again, just to give kind of an operational definition here of interconnected systems framework, it's really a structure and process for leaders in education and mental health who have authority to come together and make decisions about how people spend their time, how they're going to address any needed policy changes or funding structures in order to support improved outcomes for youth and families within schools. So it's not meant to be one more new initiative or another new thing that schools are doing. It's really to take the work that's already happening and expand and enhance it into one comprehensive system. So ISF therefore enhances the multi-tiered system of support core features, and that includes expanding our teams within schools to have mental health providers on them, to expand the data that we're looking at in schools, as well as bringing in community data to better inform the decisions we're making about the practices we're selecting across the tiers. The use of universal screening for social, emotional, and mental health challenges, and that needs to include both externalizing and internalizing concerns. And then, as I mentioned, monitoring for both fidelity of the implementation of interventions as well as progress for impact and outcomes for students. And all of this is done through ongoing coaching that involves both professional development and technical assistance. These four key messages are the messages that our national centers have come to agreement on when talking about ISF with state, district, and school leaders. The first one is around a single system of delivery, meaning that rather than working in a co-located model, we have a single set of teams that our mental health and education partners are part of, along with family members and other key community stakeholders. That in addition to connecting students to appropriate interventions, we are monitoring their outcomes rather than only keeping track of the number of students who are receiving intervention. That mental health is for all. So first of all, that we're paying attention to the mental health and wellness of adults in schools, and then equipping them so they feel competent and confident to address the mental health needs of students, and that we're thinking about it from a prevention lens and giving equal priority to mental health as we do academics, behavioral needs, and even physical health in our schools. And then, of course, using those multi-tiered system of support core features to install school mental health. I'm going to just pause really quick, Catherine, just to see if there were any questions or comments that have popped up in the chat.
I have not gotten any questions yet, and if everybody knows where the chat is, if you don't, just let me know. But we can certainly, I will pass your questions on to Kelly, either as she's speaking, if it needs to be something that needs to be addressed right at that time, or at the end of the webinar.
All right, thank you.
I appreciate you pausing for just a minute just to see if people do have questions, and please just put them in the chat box if you'd like to.
All right, thank you. With that, I'm going to keep going then. I want to just spend a little time now, again, having us with a shared understanding of what it means to be trauma-informed. And the first thing that I want to say about that is that our team really recommends that the first thing we talk about when we're talking about being trauma-informed is starting with self-care. Because the best thing about being a teacher or an educator or a mental health provider is that it matters. And the hardest thing is that it matters every day. And so one thing we know is, just like if you fly on an airplane, they tell us, put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. And so we've got to take care of ourselves in order to be able to help and support and take care of others, especially our students and their families in our schools. And it's important that you think about your own self-care when we're discussing the topic of trauma, because it may be something that's impacted any one of us at a given point in our lifetime. And sometimes when discussing this topic, it can trigger some of those memories or feelings. And so it's really important that you think about your own wellness and self-care when talking about and addressing this topic. And so what do we mean when we say trauma? This is a definition from the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network. They have a great website with lots of resources, and I would encourage anyone to check out their materials. I included this definition from their website because for the most part, we're talking about how this plays out in schools, the impact on our students, how it might manifest. And so this definition seemed to resonate. But please be mindful that, of course, trauma can happen at any age to anyone. There's also this idea, some people kind of refer to trauma as big T's and little t's. Big traumatic events might be some sort of natural disaster perhaps, or one single life experience that was very traumatic to a person. It could be something known as adverse experiences, and I'm going to touch just very briefly on the adverse childhood experiences study here in a moment. But it could also be chronic stress or toxic stress, or these little things that happen maybe even on a daily basis that over time build up and manifest in a way that is a response from these little T's. And so when we're talking about extreme or chronic stress, it's something that can overwhelm our ability to cope, and it makes us end up feeling vulnerable, helpless, or afraid. Again, traumatic events could be things that we've experienced. It could be things that we've witnessed. These experiences are very subjective, but what ends up happening is that it interferes with our relationships, our self-regulation, and our fundamental beliefs about ourselves, others, and our place in the world. The biggest idea here that I could convey to you today is that we do not get to decide what is stressful or traumatic for someone else. And so we have to honor what someone tells us regarding their own feelings of stress or their experiences that may have been traumatic to them. As I mentioned, I want to touch just briefly on the adverse childhood experiences. This was one of the biggest public health studies that took place with over 17,000 members who were connected to a certain HMO. And the study asked about different types of experiences that these adults had as children. And essentially, what was uncovered is that the more of these 10 different adverse experiences that adults said they had as children, the higher that number from 1 to 10, the more likely these adults were to have some impact as adults. And 1 in 6 of the people in this study reported having 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. And the sample in this study were college-educated, middle class, mostly Caucasian individuals. And so you can see some of the data, and you can look up on the Center for Disease Control website lots more information about this study. So I don't want to spend too much of our time talking about it, but the big idea is that we know these adverse childhood experiences can impact learning. In fact, 51% of children who have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences have difficulty with learning and behavior problems in school, and that's in comparison of only 3% of children who have no adverse childhood experiences. And so what we know if we look at some of the data is that it's possible that up to 13 out of every 30 students in a classroom is experiencing toxic stress from 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. And so therefore, according to that data, we probably want to be thinking about what we should be doing in our school environment in total and in our classrooms to help create safe, predictable, consistent, nurturing environments. We also know that it can be very difficult to tease out what may be the manifestation of a trauma or what could be another mental health quote-unquote condition. And the four most common mental health diagnoses in kids are anxiety, depression, trauma that is having some sort of manifestation and negatively impacting the child, and conduct problems. And so these are the things that we especially want to be paying attention to when we're looking at data in our schools around the prevalence of social, emotional, and behavioral health challenges. Some of the triggers that often show up for kids are lack of personal power and control, unexpected changes, feeling threatened or attacked, feeling vulnerable or frightened, feeling shame, and sometimes even positive feelings or intimacy. We know that touch is sometimes a trigger for students. And these can show up in internal ways or external ways. And so, again, just quick pause in case there are any questions that are coming up in the chat before I move on.
Kelly, there was a question that they wanted to know if it is okay to ask students or families the ACEs questions. Is that appropriate?
That's a great question. And as a general rule, we advise strongly against this. Those questions were developed for the purpose of a research study. And more studies are underway, and in fact, there is some work being done around perhaps developing some sort of a trauma screener that reflects some of the items in those questions. However, I have heard of some schools who use those questions to ask kids or families, and thankfully we've gotten pushback even from families. The questions feel very blame and shameful. They are things that the child or the family member may not have any power or control over. And again, it was not the intention of those questions to be used as a screener or to be used as a questionnaire to be asked in that way. So rather, they could be used as a general sense. I have seen other places where, let's say there's a youth survey that asks all kinds of questions about risk and protective factors. That data might inform the types of adverse childhood experiences that students may be having, but that's a different way to look at that, those questions or that kind of data.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, I'm going to keep us moving, and we're going to talk now about having a trauma-informed response. What we know is that if we believe a person has control over his or her behavior, we're more likely to become angry with that person when they display inappropriate behavior. And as I described, trauma manifests itself in different ways in any person, and especially in children. And when kids have a manifestation that's related to trauma, they are not in control of that behavior. And so we need to start to shift our perspective from thinking of what's wrong with you to what happened to you and how can we help. And so if we have an uninformed view, you can see on the left some of the things that we might think or how we might respond to behavior. You can see, conversely, on the right, that if we have a trauma lens or we have a trauma-informed view, we start to see things differently. And that includes then how we might respond to students who've been impacted by trauma. Here, as an example, we have that a student named Ashley transferred into a teacher's class after being placed in foster care. The teacher here says, I wanted to make her feel welcome. I put my hand lightly on her shoulder when I was explaining an assignment, and she slapped my hand away. Then she stared at me defiantly. On the next slide, I'm going to show you an uninformed response, and then following will be a trauma-informed response. An uninformed teacher response may be that the teacher becomes upset, feels that the student has used physical aggression towards her, decides that the student needs to have a consequence, and Ashley is sent to the office. And essentially, there's sort of this struggle and the need then for discipline, and a teacher who feels like maybe the student is going to become physically aggressive in the future. Again, conversely, a teacher who has a trauma-informed lens and therefore a response may recognize a situation like this. Perhaps, this is the teacher saying this, perhaps I've frightened Ashley without meaning to. It's clear she doesn't want to be touched. She might have other triggers as well. Right now, she's, again, essentially feeling dysregulated. And perhaps at another time, I could kind of talk with her about that. We could help her feel safe and learn that she's safe in the classroom. I know it's common for kids in foster care to have adverse childhood experiences. I need more information here. Maybe I could check with her foster parent, the caseworker, or her school records. And so you can see how this plays out very differently when we have a different response based on how informed we are about the potential impact of trauma. Schools that are sensitive to trauma recognize the prevalence and impact of traumatic occurrences in students' lives and create a flexible framework that provides these supports across the continuum without re-traumatizing the child. This is really a journey. This isn't going to happen overnight for any of us. And when we're talking about systems change, it's even more challenging and can take longer. But the first step is to become trauma aware. We can then move to being more sensitive, responsive, and finally informed. And that is where we can really move the needle on our practices within our schools. And I'm going to show you here in a little bit some examples of how that might play out in our schools. Next, I want to just touch briefly on the impact of trauma on brain development. And so the big idea here is that when we have a typically developed brain, we spend most of our time in cognition and those higher order thinking and less time in our downstairs brain where we're really thinking about survival. But for young people who've experienced those adverse childhood experiences or some sort of a trauma, they spend more time in that downstairs survival brain and less time being able to be socially and emotionally regulated, and therefore spending time on cognition and learning. And essentially then what happens is these children aren't able to access sometimes that upstairs brain and aren't able to think through their behavior or their reaction before they act. Here we see this picture of the almond that represents the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that takes over if we feel threatened or we feel that trigger. And that's where that fight, flight, and freeze kicks in. And so the impact of trauma on learning then is that rather than seeing the world as predictable, students tend to see it as not safe and that they believe people are going to hurt them or are out to get them. And rather than feeling that they're worthwhile and they feel hopeful and optimistic about their future, rather students feel afraid or that no one will help them or they're not good enough or worthy enough for people to care about them. And instead of feeling like they have the ability to impact and change their life, they feel like they're stuck, that things aren't going to get better, and that they really need to just try to establish some power and control in their world. These students also have a higher baseline state of arousal. They're on a kind of constant yellow alert where they're watching out for danger. And again, that sort of sensitivity where they're more likely to have that fight, flight, or freeze response because of a trigger. They tend to overread or have difficulty with nonverbal communication. And so they might strike out verbally or physically. They might run out of the classroom or shut down and maybe even hide under their desk. And their views can sometimes be seen as defensive, but they see it as very justified. This can also affect, therefore, their ability to acquire language and communication skills, understand cause and effect, have empathy or take another person's perspective, to be able to attend to classroom instruction, regulate their emotions, or engage and participate in the curriculum or the learning environment. And they can't always use those executive functions of following rules and organizing their work and making plans. So what we know is this affects their school performance. They tend to score lower on standardized achievement tests, again, have difficulty with language or reading comprehension. They're more likely to be retained and also expelled and suspended from school. Excuse me. In terms of misreading cues, I'm going to show you here, again, it's hard to know what their triggers might be. And essentially how this plays out in the classroom is their behavior may show up in these sort of fight, flight, or freeze patterns because they sort of see lots of different activities as bears. And what we mean by that is if you think about right now, wherever you are, if a bear walked in, you might not know what to do about that. And you might be frightened. And you might recognize that it's a real danger. And it might play out differently for each one of us. Some of us might freeze. Some of us might try to run away. Some of us might try to fight the bear, although I wouldn't really recommend that one. And so for kids in school especially, we don't know if, again, that teacher touching them on a shoulder is a trigger, a loud noise might be a trigger, laughter might be a trigger, a certain smell might be a trigger. We don't know what it is. But essentially, they see bears everywhere, and we have to be prepared to know that their behavior might not be in their control, and we have to help them be regulated and respond and learn new coping strategies within our schools and classrooms. So how is an interconnected systems framework trauma-informed? Again, if a school is implementing school-wide positive behavior intervention and supports to fidelity, they are already setting up an environment that is safe, predictable, clear, and consistent. And this helps children who've been impacted by trauma. If we are teaching mental health literacy to all teachers, if we have mental health clinicians, whether they're employed by our districts or by mental health providers, who can provide consultation and ongoing expertise around trauma and its impact on children, on these common other mental health diagnoses like anxiety and depression and conduct, we are already setting up our schools and our interconnected, aligned, integrated system to be trauma-informed. Here's an example of a teaching matrix, which we use in PBIS, and you can see that they've added an entire column for coping skills. And this is something that we can teach to all students, and we can practice and model and reinforce and acknowledge and provide feedback around coping skills in our schools. Again, here's another example where this school has taught coping strategies for managing stress in the lunchroom. And you can see they've even set up another space where students can go if they feel like they can't manage being in the school cafeteria. And so there's lots of ways in which we can incorporate additional strategies for students who may need support around self-regulation and coping skills in our schools. How can classroom practices be trauma-informed? Again, if we're creating those safe, predictable, clear and consistent nurturing environments, we are already setting up spaces for students who've been impacted by trauma. We also know that if we arrange our classrooms in an orderly physical environment where students feel like they can safely navigate the room and know how to leave the room appropriately, if we define, teach, and acknowledge classroom expectations, routines, and procedures, and also actively supervise the classroom, we're setting up an environment that is going to support that trauma-informed care lens. Here's an example of a classroom matrix that clearly defines routines within the classroom and also includes what to do if you feel upset. So this is a way in which, again, we can teach students to recognize their feelings and know what to do if they're having a feeling that may cause them to have that fight, flight, or freeze response or the need to self-regulate. Here's another example of a classroom strategy where they've incorporated some trauma-informed strategies for all students. And so these are ideas and examples that you might be able to take back to your schools to use in order to set up a trauma-informed system. Other ideas, if you're familiar with the tiered fidelity inventory, this is a tool that is used in PBIS for establishing all of the core features of PBIS, and it's a fidelity instrument that teams can use to assess their level of implementation. We have taken those items and added some enhancements around trauma-informed. And so I'm not going to read these to you, but I will point you to our website where you can find this document and more information about setting up schools that are enhanced with mental health integration, in other words, ISF or Interconnected Systems Framework, and then further enhancements with the trauma-informed lens. And so those system features are embedded throughout all of the items. When it comes to data, you want to be thinking about how can you learn more about what's happening in your school community for students and families. So you can see here, things to think about are you using universal screening? And if not, how can you uncover other kids in your schools who may have those internalizing needs? Sometimes these are students who visit the school nurse frequently with somatic complaints like stomach aches and headaches, or ask to visit the school counselor. What other data in the community can you access in order to inform your knowledge about the impact of trauma on your students? What do you know about risk and protective factors in the community? What do you know about things like crime rates or the number of families who are connected to the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system, are utilizing the emergency room for mental health crises? And that type of data can inform the decisions you're making about the types of interventions you're putting in place across the tiers. When it comes to practices, I just touched on what we might do at Tier 1 for all students in all settings of the school, including classrooms. And again, those enhancements are spelled out here in the slide that you see about making your PBIS system trauma-informed. And you want to think about then what it might look like at tiers 2 and 3 as you link and layer higher level interventions for those kids who you might have needing additional layers of support. We don't always like to provide a list of interventions because the danger here is I don't know what the data in your school tells you about where you need to install a trauma-informed practice. So the big idea here is that your district leadership team should think about, based on the data of your school community, what interventions best meet the needs of your students. And the other thing that you should note is that there are a variety of interventions that some of them could be installed, for example, at the classroom level and delivered by teachers, and others require a higher degree of clinical expertise and some training in order to deliver for those students who may need more intensive intervention, either in a small group or individual intervention. I want to talk a little bit about an intervention called check-in, check-out. This is a highly effective, very efficient intervention that involves an additional relationship with an adult in a school. And so a lot of our PBIS schools use this intervention as the first Tier 2 intervention in their school. And it really is all about extra opportunities for students to connect with adults and receive feedback and behavior-specific praise. It also provides a higher dose of skill teaching and reinforces that safety, consistency, and predictability. Further, check-in, check-out supports regulation because students are receiving those extra opportunities in the morning and at the end of the day, a connection with an adult. And this is a time where if the adult sees that the child is not regulated, they could do a really quick activity. And we may even want to modify the check-in, check-out by having a special facilitator who could check with that child and make sure that they are ready to go about their day and that they have used some of those coping strategies. The other good thing about check-in, check-out is it uses this daily progress report. And this is a way that we can progress monitor how the child is doing on this intervention and how they're doing in the classroom. For kids who are in other higher level interventions where there are skills being taught in small group intervention, for example, we can layer those skills that are being taught in the intervention onto the daily progress report card. And this is a way that the teacher, the parent, and the child can have those skills listed out so that everyone can use the same language. And again, the child can receive additional practice and feedback and prompting around those skills. And further, it's an additional progress monitoring tool that we can use around those skills. I want to encourage all of you to use the same logic that you're already using in things like function-based assessment and behavior intervention plans for individual students, and apply that same logic when we're talking about internalizing, I'm going to say quote-unquote behaviors for kids who've experienced anxiety, depression, or a trauma that's manifesting at school. And so there's an example here where the child may have a trauma that's manifesting at school, and while they're learning new skills and participating in something like CBITS as a small group instruction, maybe a replacement behavior is that this child goes to the nurse's office instead of having that fight, flight, freeze response in the classroom that is disruptive. And so you can see we can use the same logic we already use in our schools and apply it when we have these behaviors that manifest as a result of trauma. Again, trauma-informed practices create those safe, predictable, consistent environments. They build community and relationships. They teach new skills, specifically coping strategies, and they support regulation. I want to just give a quick example now. And here, this is an example of one district where in their district they've had an increase in the percentage of low-income enrollment in the past 10 years. They've seen a loss of employment over the last 10 years as well. They've seen an increase in hospitalizations for both adults and youth. They've seen an increase in drug use, and they've seen an increase in more restrictive placements for students by the district. Now, this certainly impacts families. Sometimes when we're talking about mental health restrictive placements like hospitalizations or residential treatment, or impact of drug use and abuse like treatment or incarceration, this leads to families being separated. I want to say, though, that sometimes this plays out in different schools within the same community in different ways. And so we have to be mindful of the data rather than thinking about the life circumstances. In other words, just because a child experiences an event that may be traumatic, it doesn't mean that it's going to negatively impact them or manifest in school. So here you can see that in School A and School B, their data looks very different, even though these two schools are in this same community that's had all of those data points. It looks like the data from School B is, I would say, more positive or not as concerning as the data in School A. And so therefore, School A may need to strengthen their universal and Tier 2 supports around the idea of trauma. And so that might mean expanding their universal teaching of social emotional skills, including things like identifying and expressing feelings, teaching all students about brain development and the impact of trauma, teaching all classrooms self-regulation strategies and scheduling a time for them to use those strategies, and also having a trauma-informed Tier 2 group that students who need additional support could benefit from. School B, on the other hand, may need to only add a lesson on brain development to their problem-solving skills group or their academic skills group and have a trauma-informed Tier 2 group available, but they may not need to do those same things at Tier 1 that School A did. All right, I'm going to pause now and see if there are any questions, and I also want to point you to some resources.
There are a couple of other questions, and the first one was, how do I know if a student has experienced trauma?
Right, great question. What I think I want to say about that is that if you just look at a general classroom, you may not know which kids in that classroom have experienced trauma. Again, as I showed earlier, we could guess that probably about up to 20% of them have and at least experienced some adverse childhood experiences. And so that is why we encourage setting up those safe, predictable, consistent environments. If you have children who are manifesting some behaviors or uncover from data that you have perhaps some internalizing issues, you may not know if that's a result of a trauma. You can still teach those self-regulation and coping skills, and you can assess further, which may involve those clinicians who you are working with. You might ask families about the child's experiences. And that might help further inform. The bottom line, though, is we don't need to know if a child has experienced trauma to still set up those safe, predictable, consistent environments and provide higher doses of intervention based on the issues that are manifesting and based on our decisions when we're looking at multiple sources of school community data.
The other question is will your PowerPoint be available for the attendees?
I'm not sure if I know the answer to that, but maybe you do.
If it's okay with you, we could certainly post it on our website and make it available, or they are welcome to contact us here at the School Behavioral Health and we can get a copy to them. But I think the best place and where this recording will be housed is on our website.
Okay, that's great. I will say that at midwestpbis.org, if you look under content and then trauma, we have an entire web page with multiple modules that really expand on all of the concepts that I covered today. We also have multiple pages if you look at the mental health integration ISF pages with the new material that is available. That includes the chapters that I mentioned for the ISF Monograph Volume 2, and also these fact sheets. There are 3 of them that we co-published with the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and those 3 fact sheets have some really great short summaries of interconnected systems framework, and I think you'll find them helpful as you explore these materials and resources. Were there other questions, Catherine?
I think that was the only other one I had. Anyone on the call, do you have questions? If you're on a phone, you can do *6 to unmute yourself. And if anyone else has questions, you can either just type them in the chat box or in the Q&A box.
Right. I know you said you wanted to save time in our hour together so that we could have some dialogue and discussion and some chatting. I know that it's a little tricky when we're connecting virtually, but I'm certainly happy to have some further discussion. I also wanted to make sure that you have my email so that if there's a specific question that you want to ask outside of the webinar, I'm certainly happy to respond to email as well.
I do not see any additional questions right now. So if you feel like everything is covered, we could end a little bit early, give everyone back 15 minutes, and I will start getting the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation on our website. Was there anything else, Kelly, that you thought would be helpful?
I don't think I can think of anything right now. Thank you.
I thought that was great. All right, so everyone, it's going to be on the website probably by tomorrow at the very latest. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Kelly, for doing this.
Thank you.
All right.